welcome to Digital Queers, LGBTQ representations in contemporary television. I am really delighted to have gathered together two panels worth of really amazing scholars who are doing work in digital television and queer representations. And I'm also extremely excited to hear what they all have to say, and also what you have to say about what they have to say. My name is Catherine Sender. I'm in the Communication Studies Department here at the University of Michigan, and I'm going to introduce the panelists in a minute. Before I do, I just want to say thank you to our sponsors, who include the Department of Communication Studies, the Howard R. Marsh Center, the Global Media Studies Initiative, the Institute for the Humanities, and the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. And I also want to give a special shout out to, I can't believe that people can't hear me, usually I'm really loud. Is that better? Yes. Okay. I don't have to do all that again, I hope. Okay. I also want to give a special shout out to Kate Dyche. Where are you? She's being, there you are. Who has been our amazing production coordinator for this project, and you've been absolutely, completely solid and organised, and I really appreciate that. So a couple of bits and pieces. So firstly, we have beverages and snacks at the back of the room, so do feel free to just go back and graze when you wish to. We are live streaming this event, so just be aware that you may be on camera, and we are also recording it, and that will be uploaded to the Communication Studies Department's event page. So in a couple of days, we'll have that available if you want to re-watch. And part of that requires that we use microphones. So during the Q&As, if you could, Kate will be running around with the microphones, so please make use of that. We are also encouraging people to tweet this event, so people both in the room and also watching the live stream. And so the hashtag Digital Queers at UN_comstudies. So please make use of that. And Kate and I have a sort of extraordinary kind of low-tech version of how I'm going to handle that. She's going to text me your tweets because I don't tweet. What else? Okay. So if you are in my class 312, Com 312, there's a sign-up sheet at the back, so make sure you sign in before you leave so that you'll get your extra credit point. Okay, so this is how it's going to go. So we have two panels. This current panel will go till 5:30, and then we'll have a quick 15-minute break so we can all sort of recharge. And then we'll have the second panel, and I'll do a little bit of a sort of closing remarks thing at the end. And just to give a little bit of an overview of the context of this, in 1998 I did the first documentary for the Media Education Foundation called Off the Straight and Narrow, which brought together a group of scholars who were working in LGBTQ television to talk about the history and contemporary landscape as it then was. And I did a second one in 2006 called Further Off the Straight and Narrow. And it was becoming pressing that I did a third one, and which, wait for it, is called Beyond the Straight and Narrow. And so when I was thinking about sort of introducing this session, I was thinking, what did queer images look like in 2000? Well, what did it mean? Excuse me. What was going on in 2006? What did the media landscape look like that then? And so YouTube was only just getting started. It had only been around for a year. Netflix was just distributing DVDs. They weren't streaming yet. Basic cable was just beginning to do more imaginative stuff. The newest big show. I don't know what's happening. Excuse me. The newest big show around was Will and Grace in terms of gay representations. And on reality TV, Queer Eye was, the first version was the big deal. So there was no Glee, there was no Modern Family, there was no Ugly Betty on network television, there was no Orange is the New Black, there was no Sense8, there was no Transparent, and there were no web series of the kinds that we would recognize today, like Anyone But Me, Broad City, and Brown Girls. And what's been really remarkable is since 2006, my research assistants and I have found 280 shows that featured as regular or recurring characters LGBTQ people. And so this strikes me as being both sort of a wonderful cornucopia and also a big challenge, because for the last 2 documentaries that I made, I could actually watch everything, pretty much everything that had appeared on US television, which of course I can't do now, not while I have a proper job. So, so it's a very different kind of landscape than we had before. And you know, one of the questions is, when we have such a cornucopia, is it like, oh great, well, you know, we're everywhere, it's fine, you know, it's all one, or are there still ways that we need to think about the kinds of people that we tend to see over and again, the kinds of narratives we tend to hear? And so part of what we'll be talking about this afternoon is not just, oh, you know, these things are new and interesting, but also still some of the limits on that, and how we make sense of these media representations within this contemporary landscape. So, how I'm going to do this is I'll introduce all the panels up front, and then we'll work through the panelists up front, and then we'll work through. And then we'll have, they'll talk for about 12 minutes each, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of each panel. Okay, so for this panel, we have Amardine Christian, there he is, who is an assistant professor in communication at Northwestern and is also a Peabody Fellow. And your recent book, Open TV, Innovation Beyond Hollywood, considers the rise and opportunities of web-based independent television, including increased spaces for representation and giving creative opportunities to LGBTQ and other people of color and other minorities. Then we're going to hear from Eve Eng, who's an assistant professor in the School of Media Arts and Studies at Ohio University. And her book in progress is From Gay Stream to Multi-Stream, Reconfigurations of Digital Media and Commercial Culture. And Eve writes about LGBTQ fandom, industrial production cultures, and transnational flows of queer media. Then we're going to hear from Larry Gross, who is professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and author of 2 of the foundational books in queer media studies, Contesting Closets, The Politics and Ethics of Outing, and Up From Invisibility, Lesbians, Gay Men, and the Media in America. And then we'll hear from Lisa Henderson, who's professor in communication at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And her book, Love and Money, Queers, Class and Cultural Production, looks at how LGBTQ people bring creativity and solidarity to alternative forms of media making. So please join me in welcoming our 4 panelists. Well, should we just kind of pull to one side so we're not in the way and we can see?
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to these all-star panels, not just one all-star panel, 2 all-star panels, and giving me a chance to talk about this work and what I'm calling the open TV market that was born out of the internet. So in my book, Open TV, Innovation Beyond Hollywood and the Rise of Web Television, I chart this period in media history where independent creators had the opportunity to both make and distribute their shows independently of the television system. A way to think about this would be the show High Maintenance, which is one of the more famous shows to come out of this. It was an indie show created by a husband-wife team, Katya Blickfeld and Ben Sinclair, though they've now split up and Katya is now queer. And yeah, good for her. And the show talks about a weed dealer, played by Ben on the left there, who delivers products to stressed out New Yorkers every single episode is a different customer, and it's kind of an anthology series that focuses on how weed is part of New York culture at this particular moment. That show caught the eye of Vimeo, which is an open upload platform where a lot of creators were just bringing up their shows and putting them online. And they wanted to do original programming, so they funded 6 more episodes of High Maintenance, a little bit longer, 15 to 20 minutes, as opposed to 5 to 10 minutes, giving them a bigger budget, and also mostly ownership of their work, and almost all the sales after Vimeo recouped their investment. That caught the attention of HBO, who decided to pick it up in a rare move going straight to series. So High Maintenance did not have to go through the pilot process of legacy television, where the networks makes the first episode to see if the show will work. That process is decades old. The networks spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on that every year, and it's pretty inefficient. It really leads to the hierarchies that we see in television, where not that many people get to make TV, because off the gate, to get into TV, you're talking about the network investing $1 million to $5 million, sometimes $10 million in your work, and they just don't do that for new creators. So we can see how the web really allowed this team to pilot their own show, to develop their own show without the networks. The networks came to them once the show was pretty much already developed. It had a fan base, a voice, and a world that they had built. So I argue in my book, and I do apologize, I did give a version of this talk here 2 months ago for those of you who were here, but I wanted to give it to the folks who weren't here, because it's basically the argument in my book. So I argue in the book that we've gone from a closed network-driven development process to a more open development process where shows emerge and are driven by producers, by their fans, oftentimes through crowdfunding, and occasionally, though rarely, through sponsors who will actually fund individual series because they don't want to pay for 30-second spots on TV. There's a huge asterisk on open because, of course, the Trump administration has repealed the net neutrality rules that were put in place by the Obama era, and that could be what Tim Wu calls the master switch, right, that turns off this openness and freedom of expression and puts it in the hands of corporations, which already seems to be happening with Netflix spending $8 billion a year on content, and Amazon and Facebook and YouTube all spending upwards of $1 billion a year. This has multiple effects on production, representation, and distribution. In terms of production, the producers themselves, the writers, get to control what gets into the story as opposed to the network giving notes. In terms of representation, and this is where queer studies becomes most important, the representations we see, I argue, are not so much focused on authenticity, which we can think of as a way of thinking about representation where we basically can list the characteristics, right, that a community is supposed to represent, and then authenticate our representation against that, versus sincerity, which is more about a negotiation of what that cultural meaning means between the creator of that story and the people that they are speaking to, which more often than not was the communities that they were representing in the show, right? So if you were a queer woman making a show about queer women, you were anticipating your audience was also queer women, and that they would just get certain things, and they also wouldn't get certain things, right? And those would be the things that would be particular to your experience that would actually be negotiated in the comments, through crowdfunding campaigns, right, and the ways in which you talked about the show. And then in terms of distribution, you do have some indie TV networks, some distribution portals like Netflix, but that are indie. But unlike Netflix, they don't have money. And so while they are more flexible than corporate networks and they can give creators more control over their narratives, they tend not to make money, and most of them die. Though not all of them. Some of them have been around for a little bit. So in the book, I end on the problems of the networked era, which is, this era that we find ourselves. And even though I found all this innovation and openness, I saw the market moving towards big data, algorithmic culture, and marketing that is inherently discriminatory, right? And also forces networks to sort of develop bigger budget productions in order to justify getting bigger audiences to get that big data, right? So you can think about Netflix right off the gate spending $100 million on House of Cards, outbidding HBO in 2012 as a kind of really key moment in web television where smaller narratives seemed to be maybe on the way out. So this challenged short form as an art form, and I do believe that short form TV is its own art form that could be cultivated and developed over time, and a broader challenge of intersectional representation. So, you know, the cover for this symposium, the poster is Orange is the New Black, which is maybe one of the most intersectional shows ever made in terms of representing really diverse groups of women who are queer and black and brown, and yet that show still seems to be an outlier. Even as we have almost 500 shows on TV, not too many of them are intersectional. And even in the indie market, because they see what the networks are buying, they're not necessarily encouraged to make intersectional TV. And so this is why I started a platform called OTV now, Open Television. And I wanted to ask the question, how does queer television develop? And really, by queerness, I'm thinking about the exploration of alternative sexuality across race, gender, class, religion, citizenship, you know, disability, all the indices of identity that tie us together but also make us who we are. A broader way to ask that question would be how does scale affect value? And specifically, what might small-scale television look like? And would the representations of queer people be different if the scale of development was intentionally small as opposed to intentionally big in the case of the networks you know, Netflix, HBO, and the like? And so by development and asking about this development, I track the process of financing, producing, distributing, and exhibiting these series both online and in Chicago. By tracking that process, I get a sense of the possibilities of short form and small scale development, but then of course also the limits and the constraints, both on the artists that I collaborate with in the city of Chicago and increasingly on myself, as we have ignited, it seems, a craze for web series, and every week now someone is pitching me a new show, and I'm like, I don't have any money, I can't help you that much. But I give people advice, I always take the call and try to help develop the market there. And Chicago is its own kind of fascinating place that I would love to talk about in Q&A if anyone's interested. But I actually think the city itself is a kind of ideal incubator for this kind of really focused intersectional programming because it's away from the coast. It has a really diverse art scene, both in terms of the cultures and identities and there being queer people and brown people and black people, but also in terms of having dance and theater and spoken word. The writer for Brown Girls was a poet. It was her first script. So I'm going to actually use half my time in this presentation, and hopefully I have 6 minutes to play my trailer. Because I feel like a lot of the data is in the work itself, right? I want people to sort of go to this site and ask themselves, I'm like, is that my time? And ask themselves, like, why doesn't my TV look like this? So the work of critique is both in the production as well as in the tracking all of that stuff and coding everything and, you know, writing articles and all that stuff. So enjoy this extended trailer and hopefully your mind is blown to queer bits.
Everything's gonna be okay. Yep. But you're the one that won't let your eyebrows stand in their truth, okay? You asked me to do this. Well, Sheila, I had no idea how hetero-flexible you were.
Good morning, sunshine.
This witch hunt's ongoing.
Eradicate difference, any alternative. A historical struggle to eradicate magic.
Doesn't sound like she's a very good friend.
No, she's like my best friend.
Desire is a very complicated thing.
Hello, headshot and white resume, please.
Yeah, here you go.
Thank you very much.
We want to tell you a classic timeless story.
Know your self-worth and then add tax.
No, but your forehead's cut out.
Still feel guilty that the prayer I prayed for my father was prison. I want to be free. I want to see you free.
No, not Pakistan, Pakistan. No, I'm not saying it with an accent. You're saying it with an accent. Actually, you're saying it completely wrong.
Sapapi. Cállate con esta mierda.
Do you ever think that we could work again?
What a bird looks like. They like being warm. They like synthetic fibers. They like young, pheromone-ridden, euphoric bodies. And then I was like, oh, follow the tumbleweed.
Do you remember? At the bar, you said that you were into him, so you made me give him my phone number.
You see, everything comes back to money. Money.
Girl, I've gathered. And on that note, we're done here. Immediately as fuck.
Mom worries about the suits and ties. I grew up liking boys, but also had a strong attraction to affinity for women.
I'm in a book club where we only read Quran. Mashallah.
I thought I turned off the notifications.
Let's be clear. I'm the Beyonce. I don't get kicked out. Miley Cyrus and Katy Perry are chasing after me. Damn, yo, we got you over this shit. I'm not catching a charge for some tampons. Listen.
Practicing a paragraph brings satisfaction to your current state of being without turning outwards for validation. I heard you've been back in the studio lately.
I have actually. It's been a lot of work. Been trying to keep up with the likes of you.
No, don't do that.
I'm fine.
Now, this is the first time a black-owned firm will handle such a big project on behalf of the city.
Thank you. Yeah, what's sleep? What is that?
I teach in a classroom where every third class something goes wrong. So when nothing goes wrong, I'm like, yes. But let me get my ass talk. So my talk is on queer baiting, and the topic is something that I didn't talk about 2 months ago here, but I did talk about last year at Lexicon, if anyone was there, but no one is saying yes. So when Alexander Doty wrote Making Things Perfectly Queer in 1993, he offered an expansive way of reading popular media queerly. It wasn't just about finding queer subtext, but also about how queerness inheres in entire genres and the availability of queer subject positions more generally. In a certain sense, though, these were still non-canonical interpretations at the textual level. Since then, obviously, there's been a huge increase in LGBTQ representations. Catherine said 280 shows and counting. But it's also been during this shift that charges of queerbaiting against media producers have arisen. How did we get from Xena Warrior Princess, 1995 to 2001, when Xena Gabrielle shippers literally called themselves subtexters? Does anyone remember this? To charges of queerbaiting being levied against showrunners, even for canonical couples. What I'll argue is that to understand queerbaiting discourses today, we need to consider two conditions of contemporary media. One is the increased importance of media paratexts, as discussed by Jonathan Gray and others, which are now integral to the reception of what John Fiske called the primary text. And here I'm particularly concerned with official paratexts officially produced, including studio or network promotional materials, as well as what I call producer paratexts. This is commentary by directors, writers, actors, and other creative team members about their texts. Social media platforms, particularly Twitter for the initial commentary and Tumblr for fan circulation of that commentary, are key channels. And also important are interviews at entertainment conventions like Comic-Con. Producer engagement with viewers is partly motivated by the precarity of producing in a post-network, or maybe post-network, era of audience fragmentation, and the proliferation of programming in the era of peak TV. But when producers seek to heighten the appeal and profile of their shows by encouraging the hopes of queer viewers for stronger representation, they also face, as I'll discuss, being enmeshed in queerbaiting discourses. And there's also what I call queer contextuality. This is my own term. It's a little bit awkward, but I couldn't think of a different way to call it, which I define as referring to the current and previous landscapes of LGBT media narratives, how these inform viewer evaluations of any particular text, and how they see the socio-political and economic feasibility of having a canonical LGBTQ narrative. It's worth noting that despite the recent increases in queer representation, even for younger viewers, let's say teens or 20s, I think a lot of you, and certainly older than that, there remains a cumulative representational deficit across the time period that we have been consuming media. On the other hand, many viewers, as Amar talked about, now have access to web series, streaming services, and, pirated downloads of content that offer better depictions of queer characters and narratives. Some of this content is not US produced, and viewers know that, but its consumption, nevertheless, I think has affected expectations for the content here. So I want to present an analytical model of textual and paratextual interpretation within conditions of queer contextuality that accounts for the historical contingencies for both queer subtext and queerbaiting. But first, some examples. So starting with, like I showed before, Xena, one of the earliest mainstream programs where content strongly suggestive of same-sex, romantic, or sexual interest was both intentionally included and publicly acknowledged by producers. In a season 2 interview, executive producer Liz Friedman noted, quote, "We opened up with the two of them fishing naked. It was actually a hot tub scene. There was a non-naked fishing scene. And we're about to have a Halloween episode that will certainly have some nice moments for our queer fans. a little lesbian vampire show. So you see Gabrielle biting Xena. However, such comments occurred in the context of both Xena and Gabrielle having multiple male love interests, as well as the dearth of other US shows with queer leads. So, despite definite dissatisfaction, a large majority of Xena Gabrielle fans accepted that subtext was as far as Xena, the show as aired, could go. Fast forward a decade to Rizzoli and Isles on TNT 2010 to 2016, where we had Jane Rizzoli, a homicide detective, Moira Isles, chief medical examiner, working together in a Boston police department. The two characters, I hope you can tell, had an undeniable butch-femme dynamic in terms of their appearance and demeanor, as well as Jane repeatedly protecting Moira from danger. The show acknowledged both that Jane might be seen as a lesbian. In one episode, an angry interviewee calls her, quote, a skinny, greaseball dyke detective. And also that people might believe Jane and Moira to be a couple. Occasionally, they pretended to be. The two of them even discussed the possibility of being attracted to women. For the official paratext, though, it was the TNT promos that were the most suggestive. A TNT Season 2 promo showed Jane and Moira at a speed dating event, having no luck connecting to a string of men, finally ending up at a table together. Moira remarks, as you see, we should do this again sometime. Jane agrees, the two toast to that, as the voiceover says, Rizzoli and Isles, a perfect match. The next season, a promo showed a tight shot of Jane and Moira huddled together, followed by a voiceover comment by Jane that opposites attract, during a slow-mo shot of the two staring at each other while walking. Here's a Season 4 poster, two of them are handcuffed together with tagline, bound for life. And then for Season 5, let's just watch. TNT apparently got so much flack for this particular promo that it was withdrawn shortly after it was released, but of course nothing really disappears from the internet.
Behind every great woman,
All these women think you're hot.
is another great woman.
Wow, I'm not flip for that.
Starting June 17th
You don't want to sleep with me?
on TNT.
Do you?
Every Tuesday is Ladies' Night.
She's a Laura. Do me a favor, never finish that sentence.
Rizzoli and Isles. New season premieres June 17th at 9.
Two are still, yes, we are still together.
TNT drama. Boom.
Isn't that great? In contrast to Rizzoli and Isles, on The 100, airing on the CW, the two characters at the center of the queer-baiting discourses were both canonically queer. In a post-nuclear apocalyptic world with warring groups, Clark, the lead character, and Lexa met in Season 2 as commanders of their respective factions. During negotiations, Lexa initiated a kiss, which Clark reciprocated briefly before saying she wasn't yet ready to be with anyone. It was at this point that the show first started garnering mainstream critical attention for its queer representation, and the 100 producers highlighted these points in tweets or retweets of positive reviews. The creative team also actively allayed fan fears that Lexa would be killed, since Lexa's actor, Alicia Debnam-Carey, was not a series regular. While the Season 3 finale was being filmed, showrunner Jason Rothenberg tweeted an invitation to come see the shooting, which was in downtown Vancouver as opposed to closed set. And various fans did, and they took and circulated video of Clark and Lexa interacting, leading many to believe that Lexa was well and alive at the end of the season. So whereas the paratext for Rizzoli and Isles pertinent to queer-baiting discourses suggested a romantic relationship that never became canonical, with The 100, it was the fact that producers actively courted viewers invested in seeing a same-sex relationship and repeatedly brandished their positive LGBT representation credentials, only to end the Clark-Lexa relationship in one of the tropiest bury your gays tropes of all, killing Lexa just after Clark and Lexa had made love for the first time. So the fallout was fast and furious, as you might imagine, or maybe you remember. But I want to come back to present a general model of queer-baiting discourses, which I argue arise as the outcome of increased paratextual discourse about LGBT content at a specific moment of queer contextuality. Mapping out the relationships of texts, paratext, and queer contextuality gets us to my model. Are you ready? There we go. Yeah, I realize it's pretty dense, so let's start with two elements. First, viewer expectations regarding canonical queer content, which is kind of encapsulated by the questions, are we going to get it, and is it going to be any good? Second, the level of canonical queerness in a text, from subtextual to canonical, so plotting viewer expectations on the vertical axis against textual content on the horizontal gives us this first part of the model. Next, the model shows that viewer expectations about canonical queer content derive not just from the text, where's my cursor? Not just from the paratext, but from intertextual readings of text and paratext together. And then the final component is queer contextuality. Again, this refers to the circumstances of LGBTQ media representation, both past and present, as particular viewers have experienced it. And queer contextuality does a few different things. So I'm going to start from the right. First, it informs how viewers assess the queer content that is canonical. For example, is a same-sex couple getting enough screen time? Are they being allowed to show enough affection, given other depictions of queer couples on TV shows now? It also informs viewer expectations about canonical queer content, like, could Rizzoli and Isles happen on TNT if there's Callie in Arizona on Grey's Anatomy over on ABC? Finally, it informs the intertextual readings of texts and paratexts. So for viewers of The 100, who are probably familiar with, for example, Beau and Lauren on Lost Girl, another sci-fi drama, even though that was a Canadian show and we know the Canadians do it better, still, a well-written and ongoing storyline for Clark and Lexa seemed very feasible. So now we're back at the full model, but I've added examples. When the text doesn't offer canonical queer content, where is that text? Oh yeah. But viewer expectations of canonical queer content are low. That's when we are in the realm of queer subtext like Xena Warrior Princess. On the right-hand side, when the text does have canonical queer content and it matches up to the high viewer expectations, then it instantiates, hooray, desired queer representation. For example, The 100 before Lex's death in episode 307. But when viewers develop high expectations of canonical queer content through reading texts and paratexts at a particular moment of queer contextuality, yet the text fails to deliver, either because queerness remains subtextual or because the canonical queer narrative is problematic, that's when viewers feel queer-baited. And here we have The 100 after Lex's death, we have Rizzoli and Isles, W13 stands for Warehouse 13, in case anyone knows that one as well. Just to end on a couple of notes for further consideration, some might wonder if the increasing scope of what can fall under the queer-baiting space will have a chilling effect on content producers who are afraid of being seen as falling short, not simply for not providing LGBTQ representation, but for not doing it well enough. And indeed, I have seen rumblings that Black Lightning, a new superhero show on the CW, is queer-baiting because it dangled the prospect of a new girlfriend for one of Black Lightning's daughters, Anissa. But that character hasn't been seen for weeks, so people are like, queer-baiting, even though Anissa has been definitively confirmed as a lesbian in other ways and was shown in bed with her previous girlfriend. A second issue is about theorizing the non-canonical. Julie Russo argued in 2013 that queer subtext continues to, quote, hold value and pleasure outside the mass media's limited repertoire. And I think that there's more to say about the relationship between subtextual readings and canonical representations in our current conditions of queer contextuality. Thank you.
No pictures, sorry. So Catherine asked me to talk about two very different topics and then said choose, and I said, well, I'll try and do a little of each. Part of my role here, I think, is historical, is to set this in a little bit of a context. And one way to do that is to imagine that we're in 1950, which at least I can remember. I may be the only one in this room who can. But in 1950, homosexuals, as the term would have been used then, were quite clearly defined as sinners in the religious context, as criminals in the legal context, and as mentally ill in the scientific context. So it was really a fairly dire point. But something revolutionary happened then, and I'll use 1950 as a shorthand, but it's around that period. Something conceptual happened in America, in particular, which was the emergence of the self-image as a minority community. Previously, if you were queer, if you were homosexual, you were an individual who was flawed in some ways, morally, legally, psychologically, but the concept emerged and was articulated absolutely clearly by at least two people, and I'm sure others, one of whom was a closeted sociologist who called himself Donald Webster Corey, wrote a book called The Homosexual in America, and the other was a former communist activist in Los Angeles named Harry Hay, both of whom at around the same moment said, you know what, homosexuals are a minority, and we're like an ethnic minority, and we are oppressed like an ethnic minority, and we need to respond like an ethnic minority. That's a very American view, the notion of ethnic minority as an identity and as a political stance. Now, this happens, I think, in part, or at least coincides with, the emergence of physical queer communities that begin to emerge in the second half of the 20th century after the Second World War, for lots of reasons we don't have time to go in here, but it had to do in part with the demobilization of hundreds of thousands of young men from the army and young women who had been working in defense industries, and many of them didn't go home. They stayed in cities, particularly on the coast, but also Chicago, among others, and they began to create what later became known as gay ghettos, gay communities. In other words, they began to actually create a community rather than merely identify as a community. They began to create a community, and again, in great shorthand, that turned over a period of decades, we're now talking about from the 50s into the 60s, into the 70s, turned, as happens, this is the American model of the ethnic minority, turned into economic and political power. In the United States, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, and sexual minorities gain political power through urban concentrations. That's how it works. You get enough people together, you begin to become an economic bloc, you begin to become a voting bloc, and guess what? They start paying attention to you. Now, the important thing to note here for our current discussion is that to say that a community began to emerge, people lived there, they moved there, they could live openly there in a way they couldn't had they returned to the small towns or rural areas or even big cities they came from. They could live open lives without being fired, without being evicted, without even, well, they still were hassled by the cops. They still would be arrested and hassled. But that was a community that you found. It was not a community you were born into. And this is a distinction between the concept of a queer community and the other community. I was talking about ethnic communities, racial communities, which are communities of origin. You're born into a community of color or a racial or religious community. And even though you may suffer hostility from the surrounding society, you have the support of parents, of siblings, of friends. You have the community support. Queer kids don't have that. They're born in enemy territory. At least they certainly were back then. So this was a community you found. And you might ask, how did you find it? Well, here's where the media begin to play a significant role. The media began, as we moved through the 50s into the 60s, began to notice these concentrations and began to report on them. They began to surveil them. The first time the New York Times had a story on the front page dealing with homosexuals, the headline was, "Rise of Overt Homosexuality in City Provokes Wide Concern." In other words, people were concerned about this increasingly openness of these emerging communities, Greenwich Village, the Castro, others in Los Angeles and Chicago, Boys Town, and so forth. But by alerting the public, by this kind of surveillance about it, they also alerted queers, proto-queers, would-be queers, all over the country where to go. And that further built up this kind of movement. So the tricky thing here to keep in mind always is this is a community that people have to find and create. This is kinship we choose. This is not necessarily birth kinship, although I hope it's reasonable to say that for many of you in this room, that has not been your experience. You haven't necessarily felt you were born in enemy territory, by which I mean you didn't necessarily feel as you began to realize that you were not what you were expected to be from birth, that the people around you were not necessarily upset, horrified, sad at finding that out. But I think it's safe to say that for many kids today, still the realization that they are not what their parents and grandparents and everybody else expected them to be, they don't think this is going to be greeted with great elation or joy, like, oh boy, we really wanted one of those in the family. Probably not. And here again, and this is a world that is changing rapidly, as you've already heard today, the media play a different role than they did in the past, because increasingly now, the messages you find in the media when you go in to find out who you are and what it's like are not filtered through the required hostility of the mainstream media that always need to be careful not to appear to be endorsing or supporting or thinking even that this is a good thing. Even if we can tolerate it, we don't necessarily have to like it. Now you find media created by and for and of people like you, as AJ was saying, and as you were talking more about the paratext about it. But it's a different world now. And for those of you who are much closer to this stage of trying to figure these things out, you now have the possibility of entering into a conversation that is much more egalitarian and much more engaging with you than merely presenting images which you now have to read or queer in Alex Doty's sense in order to find some comfort in. Turning to the other topic, which, well, one other point on that, which is the other major change that happened, and it happened for a variety of reasons, including the enormous topic of AIDS, which we don't have time for here, is that by the early 90s, the political force of this gay community that had begun to emerge over several decades shifted its direction or shifted its view from creating a new kind of world to joining the real regular world, and moved into a direction you might loosely call assimilationist, and began to demand acceptance into the most mainstream institutions in American culture, the military, marriage, and have been successful. And the reason, I think, in part, there are many reasons, but one reason I think in part is that largely through the efforts or the consequences of media representations over several decades, people began to see the issues raised by the queer community as civil rights issues. And they began to be issues that non-queer people thought they supported because they were basic civil rights issues. So today, if you want to feel good about yourself, you are in favor of LGBTQ rights, even if you're not LGBTQ yourself. It's just standard, equal civil rights perspective. When that changed, it began to filter through society in a way that then made the demand, which is an actual controversial demand, the demand to be allowed to be serve in the military, go to Iraq and kill people, or get married. It seemed like a reasonable thing, as in fact they are. They're very conservative demands. They're not radical, and in that sense they can be assimilated. As people begin to speak more for themselves, the question also arises of who gets to be playing that role. And this is the other question is, so one way to put it is, if all of this has changed so much in the last few decades, why do we not have any A-list, openly queer movie stars? Why are the roles, now that they're there, still played by, apparently, at least publicly, straight actors? And of course the answer in part is, well, they're not always. Some of them aren't, in fact, straight. Some of them are just playing straight, just as they're then playing gay roles. But the answer is, particularly in the case of the commercial media, the ones not discussed by AJ, is that an actor, particularly an actor with A-list possibilities, is not an individual. That person is an investment. That person is an investment made by a system that has lots to choose from. There's always a reserve army of the uncast who can be gone to. And when an agent, and agents are the key gatekeepers here more than anyone. Agents and managers are more conservative in their gatekeeping role than are the studios or the executives. When you are chosen as someone who has the potential to be an A-list actor, the question is, are you credible as an action lead and a romantic lead? It's that combination that defines the A-list. Being credible across that range of roles, being able to, quote, open a movie, as they put it, and increasingly being able to be credible in a movie drawn from a comic book, because that's what dominates the studio system right now. In that context, it is always easy to say no and go to somebody else, because there are plenty more where any individual actor came from. There is no actor who is irreplaceable. And in that context, they're replacing they're protecting their investment. And the message is very clear to young actors. If you want to have that career, then stay in the closet. However, and this is the last point, and it's the kind of good, the optimistic point is, it's increasingly not working. And it's not working, I would say, for several reasons that you're all familiar with. One is social media. But one reason is that people are coming into this system, young actors are coming into this system who have already lived openly gay lives. They've been out in high school. They've been out in college, just as Jodie Foster was before she went back in the closet. But nowadays, it's not a matter of whether you'll come out, it's a matter of whether you'll go back. And that's much harder to enforce. And increasingly, actors are saying, I'm not going to pay that price, and getting away with it. We're not quite at the A-list point. The closest to it might be Matt Bomer, who is doing reasonably well, in television at least, with a sort of combination of action and romantic role. We have plenty of other openly gay actors, but they're neither credible as action heroes or action and romantic heroes, but we're beginning to get Luke Evans, another example of someone who was out in theater, went back into the closet, is now coming out again. So it's a very fluid moment right now. And one reason it's fluid is exactly the kind of paratextuality that Eve was talking about, and the kind of openness to the system that, that AJ was talking about. And we're now in a very interesting moment, and I'll leave it there because we may want to talk about it in the discussion, with the trans moment, which I don't think I need to tell you has become a dominant aspect of the landscape in the last year or so. And the same issues are now arising of who gets to represent who, except there, the stakes are different. And I think it's moving faster in some ways, or at least clearer in some ways, on that, although still not, as Jeffrey Tambor and others would testify. But it's very much a matter of how this translates into, when you are dealing with the commercial media, how they handle what is, after all, an enormous investment. Going back, reflecting again, something that AJ said, when the studio makes a movie, they're putting millions of dollars in, and they are necessarily protecting that investment. So, 2 points.
Yes, I am. Is there... I haven't been on a PC in God knows how long.
In which sense of the word?
I think I'll be able to play these. I've committed a cardinal academic sin, which is managing to go through all the material that Catherine and Kate kindly sent me and miss the part about duration. So those horrible people who go up to the podium and with a manuscript under their arm. So I've been slashing away. But I'm so very glad to be here with thanks to Catherine and Kate. I'm at the high end of this group by the measure of age, and it's honestly a really lovely place to be. In preparation, I've also thought about the conditions not only in television production, but critical production. Since I've been at it for a long time and can speak to some changes that are relevant to my comments here, what is the generational value added I might be able to contribute? Memory and change in a lived archive of television watching and criticism. Memory, of course, is famously unreliable, so in the end, 60-year-olds have to do what people who weren't watching or writing in 1987, and that is to go back. So I'm going to skip my reflections on the past in the interest of time, and jump ahead to say that I want something new from queer TV, less inclusive representation for its own sake, with the idea that that changes conditions for people on the ground. It does, but only so far. Less that than experiments in solidarity. That's what I want from queer TV at this point, which is just one of the reasons I'm so appreciative of Amar's project. Solidarity requires inclusion, however, so I'm not suggesting that we have to choose. I just want more. In recent work, I've referred to this as queer friendship as a political form, looking to the historical and cultural record for friendship where we don't predict it. Across class, across race, across age. Not friendship as a flush of ease or getting along or all being the same underneath, but where recognition is hard and friendship can acknowledge some of its own demands. And where friends seek to meet those demands, not to whisk them under the carpet of any number of things, of white narcissism in common, for example, much as I like Broad City and difficult people. So, as was once claimed for young, straight, cisgender men about porn, that it was educational, I look to queer TV and to critical work on queer TV that explores and thus expands the conditions and possibility of solidarity, of friendship born of generosity, kindness, realness, struggle, the need for connection and separation, and the possibility of trust beyond the terms of what we call family, chosen or otherwise. There are some critical resources that I'm going to skip past, and I'll just mention by name J.K. Gibson Graham, with whose work I've had a long and very deep romance, and I'm happy to say that I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. But drawing from them through a set of critical articulations that I won't lay out here, I've turned to a practice that I call reading for friendship. Reading less, in other words, to reveal what's ideologically wrong, commercially driven, and misrepresentative, as important as those gestures are, than to figure out something that we can use to respond to the historical and cultural record for what it can tell us about solidarity and its formations, for something to live by in very hard times. I think this is urgent. I also think the record of queer friendship and solidarity where you least expect it is deep and wide, so it's not unicorns I'm after. The outcome of such a disposition is not only that I look for the rare texts or series that meet such rarefied standards, but that I look to all texts for what they do or don't do through this lens. This is something that Andrei Cavalcanti, who I know earned his degree here, writes about, drawing on Patty Scannell and Martin Heidegger, and the idea of care structures, responding to a photography website called XX Boys by Colombian photographer Cale T. Block, a site which documents gender transition or affirmation, in which one of Cavalcanti's collaborators, Alex, acknowledged in conversation with Cavalcanti. I was really happy to read this in Cavalcanti's work and his reference to Scannell's 2014 volume on television and human liveness. I'm not sure it's a zeitgeist moment that we're in, but there is a critical premium on taking care, increasingly written about in a range of media studies subfields. And in queer studies, of course, it comes from deep within the AIDS and HIV epidemic, which is not over. It doesn't have to be subsumed by a critique of wellness discourses, as Barbara Ehrenreich or Laurie Ouellette and Sarah Benet Weiser might write, although I think that work is really important. Nor does it have to be held suspect as a first critical gesture, like we don't trust this image of caretaking. It can be explored rather than distrusted from the outset. So from this perspective, I'd like to show clips and make a few comments on two programs that Catherine asked me to consider, or invited me to consider. Both are reboots. One is Queer Eye on Netflix, and the other is Will and Grace on NBC, with the first season of the new series promptly available on Netflix before the final episode had even aired, streaming, as we know, as the new syndicator. So let me just caution you that there are spoiler alerts if you hope to watch these shows without having heard about them. To begin, mainstream commercial television is built on prodigious repetition compulsion in the pursuit of value added at lowest cost and least risk. That's not, of course, how reboots are described by their agents. They're a return to what is culturally beloved, to unparalleled performances in ensembles, in the case of Will and Grace, or to something that really got its hooks in the culture and which the culture needs now more than ever. That's Queer Eye's producer David Collins talking to Michelle Martin on NPR. Both efficiency and cultural attachment are in fact needed for the rhythms of franchise, to quote Derek Johnson quoting Bob Rehak on Flow. Not everything, remember, comes back. So what does the Will and Grace reboot offer through the lens of queer friendship? First, that in their return, 10 years after the final season of the original program, the friends are still in each other's lives. That's something that at 60 seems to me really important, even though I'm not confused about the difference between characters in series and friendship over generations, but we're looking for things to live by. Second, no one has evolved much. Though their circumstances changed, then magically went back to what they had been through the careful work of television writing that needs to be just clever enough to reset the plot and suspend or transform what was popular disappointment in the original finale. So the things that happened there that would be, sort of predicting a life into the future that no one would have because the series was ending, were set aside when the series was brought back. As is said of people who become more ourselves with age, the characters Will, Grace, Jack, and Karen are oddly more themselves. Will written more to be orderly at his own expense, Grace to be more neurotic at hers, Jack more physically expressive and acrobatic, and Sean Hayes' skill as a performer appears not to have diminished at all. And Karen more nouveau riche, spoiled, and louche. They've all become deeper versions of themselves. And I think that if you were to compare some episodes to episodes, you'd be struck by that. They're sort of sticking with certain forms of character reduction and then elaborating them in the new series. Karen still is also unforgivably more racist. as the show reveals Karen's loss of the now deceased Rosario, her Latina maid, in an episode that suggests Karen really loved her after all. Racists have long loved the women of color who work in their houses, so I'm unconvinced. But as a reliable point of outrage for Will's and Grace's human rights campaign liberalism, the Friends' capacity to forgive Trump-loving Karen counts on their whiteness in common. It's just unimaginable if you mixed up that group of 4 characters, if it were more mixed in terms of race, skin color, ethnic identification, that forgiveness of Karen would be very complicated. In that sense, the Will and Grace and Roseanne reboots may share more than critics have acknowledged, less updating through a ripped from the headlines framework than racially extractive comic realism. But Will and Grace gets to be more political than it was the first time around, and a shade less normative about friendship, family life, and sex, though a lot of that is still left to Jack. The show uses new terrain on the question of queer life that the original didn't actually contribute very much to, but the current one acts like it did. Despite President Obama's accolade that no show did more than Will and Grace to change American culture on the matter of gay life, a same-sex kiss is no longer the border condition of representation or the moment of narrative crescendo that it once was, the thing that everyone waited for, knew from paratexts to expect, and for which an applause margin was written into the script. In what I consider to be the most moving episode in the current series, set at the wedding to a new guy, Will's old boyfriend, whom Will wrongly assumes still suffers from the commitment avoidance that broke him up, the kaleidoscopic terms of sex and friendship get some play. The setting is a wedding, but as has long been true for the queer crews who worked at weddings as caterers, designers, florists, and musicians, but who didn't marry, the wedding is more a kind of incidental backdrop than a narrative high moment. So let's go to a quick wedding scene from episode 10.
Quick question, fellas. What's your favorite TV show of all time?
The Wire.
What?
The Wire. This is us. Hi, Jack.
I told you not to come. How many times do we have to have the fight where we realize I'm always right before you realize I'm always right?
We were together for 5 years. I think you'd be hurt if I didn't show up.
Oh, please, you're here to hawk him for answers about your breakup.
I'm not here to hawk. I would never hawk. I'm not a hawker. Look, I need closure, Grace. I need to find out why he broke up with me.
You don't.
It's 2 minutes of his time. What could possibly go wrong in 2 minutes?
Ask every girl who ever got pregnant at her prom.
Great wedding.
Yeah.
Want to fool around?
Yeah.
The thrill of the chase.
Guys, that ceremony was so moving. I was a wreck. I was full on Claire Danes in Homeland.
I don't get showtime. We have it, I just don't get it.
Hey, Dave, we should check on your Nana. She's not doing too good. She's got her dentures sitting next to her in an Arby's bag.
She thinks that's her going out purse.
Well, I'm really glad you made it.
I don't know, too. You got 2 minutes? It's just something I want to ask now that it's just us.
And me!
Oh.
Do it out. Hey, man, it's a great party. Can't wait to try the meatballs.
I just saw you eat like 3 off 1 toothpick.
What are you, a detective?
No, I didn't make it. Jeez, you gotta rub it in at my wedding?
Okay, pushing me off and Aunt Rita was a dick move, but we are so going on a cruise.
I just want 2 minutes with the guy. Well, why did we break up? Oh, that's why. Great. Now go marry the guy who retweeted, I got the brunchies.
Oh, that was fun. I've copped a field before, but I've never felt a cop.
Yeah, well, I've never been with a man before.
Oh. Oh, you're not kidding. Wow. I just thought you were really bad.
Which you were. I've been wanting to do that for so long.
Well, proud to have been your first. Have a long gay life, best of luck, emoji, horseshoe, steamboat, bon voyage.
I love you.
Oh, aren't you sweet, dear? You're like a baby congressman who's just crawled out from underneath his first men's room stall. Let me explain. In the gay world, what we just did was fun, but meaningless, okay? A blip. And now this blip needs to poop.
I love when you say words that aren't words.
Okay, listen, Mary.
Oh, yes, oh my God, it's happening. I've always wanted a guy to call me Mary.
Officer Drew, you're a delightful, muscly rocket ship. You're what my friend Will and I would call a spinner. But you and I are never gonna happen, okay? And you need to absorb that, like, right now. So, breathe it in, do it, and then we say...
I love you so much.
In the interest of time, I'll make a quick comment about something that follows this clip, but isn't in it, but I'm not going to comment on Queer Eye. Vince and Will didn't break up because Vince was commitment avoidant. Vince and Will, it turns out, broke up because, according to Vince, he always felt inadequate. And Will was always after him for his taste choices, for the ways he ate, for the things that he liked, for the ways that he dressed. In other words, they had a kind of relationship crash across the line of habitus. And so that's another point in this episode where, the conditions that shake down or sustain relationships get identified, and habitus, or the cultural dimensions of class, are one of them. I'd be happy to talk about Queer Eye in the Q&A, and if there's time to go back to a clip where the question of friendship is and solidarity is both more resonant and I want to say more staged, but I think there's nothing more staged than Will and Grace. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
So we have at least 5 minutes for Q&A, and we can run a little long, and so feel free to get refreshments as you wish during. So, questions from the audience.
Could Professor Henderson share her thoughts on Queer Eye? Even if
Well, it's a mixed bag, and it's a little bit different. It's no longer Queer Eye for the straight guy. Some of the targets of makeover are gay, so it quickly makes the point that style like gayness is not genetically coded. It's much, that sort of the intersectional lessons of contemporary thinking have been observed, so that many of the makeover subjects are men of color, and 2 of the Fab 5 are Karamo Brown, who is African-American in tan France, who is British Pakistani. I want to say it right, having seen AJ's clip. And there's a much greater emphasis on interiority than just style. And this is something that Catherine Sender talked about in her essay on the first series called Queen for Day. There's a new, it's quite sociological in the sense that that we make ourselves from the outside in. Now, the outside of Queer Eye is consumer culture, but it's sociological in that sense of selves being made from the outside in rather than sort of true selves being cultivated from the inside out, which is an idea that, that sometimes serves people, but I'm, as a social scientist, at least nominally, something that I don't accept. But there are moments in the new series, and I think some people have skeptically called it a tearjerker, but there are moments in the new series where I even feel like characters are trying to protect themselves from the cameras that they have voluntarily consented to being present by kind of physically moving in on each other in order to, in one case, a guy named AJ who is African American, coming out to his Mexican mother after the death of his father, and I felt even a little bit intrusive watching the scene, even though I know they consented to it. And I don't really need to, they're not actors, and so I expect it's real. I don't really need to know whether it's real. I mean, it certainly feels real in terms of the kind of apprehension about disappointing someone and then discovering that they're fine. And so there's this moment of deeply felt solidarity that I think there's really something we can take from that. I have another clip maybe later that's just a moment long, however, where a group of young people on a show called The Library, which is on a YouTube channel called Them. Does anyone know Them? Which is a non-binary, trans, queer, short 15-minute talk show. Call out Karamo Brown, the African-American culture guru, who's really the sort of therapist in the Fab Five, for his sort of assimilationism in response to online dating apps. So, you know, things expand and contract in equal proportion in relation to the past and the present, and it's sort of great to see these hard fought for lessons get take up on self-consciously by a group of teenagers who are the people on them calling out, well, maybe I don't want to use that term, criticizing Karamo Brown.
AJ, I'm curious with Open TV and some of the original series that you've produced, if, just to be really blunt about it, if any of them actually make money, if there's enough viewership to make it a sustainable model.
No. No money has been made from, like, on the platform or through the platform to date, and the idea really isn't to do that, and people look at me like I'm out of my mind when I say that, but the idea is really to keep it nonprofit. The Brown Girl show did get picked up by HBO, so they're now in the for-profit space, but not affiliated with us anymore. You know, the show is going through a whole new stage of development. You know, it'll take shape with however HBO wants it to take shape. My thinking with the platform is that there's so many people making this indie online content, and there are no institutions set up to really value that. That's been changing as I've been doing it. So like now, Sundance and Tribeca and South by Southwest all have indie episodic programs. So for some of those, a lot of those people are already repped by agents and are kind of like on the industry's radar. In Chicago, there aren't any agencies based there. And so really the path to sustainability for the platform is, are we actually serving a market function that these other market players can't play? And will one of the networks, maybe an agency, maybe some combination of the two, maybe a studio, pay us to continue to develop new stories such that they have new things to pick up that have already had some community buy-in and, you know, development on its own. My thinking is that this is a function that certain kind of organizations can play in this like PTV marketplace, but it's definitely a gamble and it's the experiment. But I haven't seen, there aren't that many models for sustainability for independent distribution online. There are a couple. There's Black and Sexy TV, Reverie TV in LA is sort of, seems like they're doing pretty well. But they're really cash-strapped, and those networks tend to be very identity focused. Like, they work within the logics of market segmentation. So, you know, it's like, this is for Black people, and really like mostly Black straight people, right? And this is for queer people, where I'm really trying to look at what does intersectionality look like when it's related to distribution, and I don't know if that can really function on the market on its own at this point. And you can look at our Facebook and Twitter follower numbers to get a sense of how well that's going. So it's interesting. I mean, like I've had meetings with the networks. You know, I'm meeting with a couple agents in LA in a couple of weeks. So I have a sense that there is demand for this kind of function. And if there isn't, I'll just stop the project and move on.
It's kind of a loaded question because I'm curious about if some of our critiques of the lack of queer representation in more mainstream media should be tempered by evidence that we don't support queer media that we're making.
Yeah, indeed. And it's sort of a challenge because there is, like Catherine said, there are queer characters on TV. So I'm wondering if people already feel satisfied by what the corporations are feeding them. I don't feel satisfied, so I kind of am helping develop other stuff as a way to whet the alternative appetite of people. But the reality is that like all this stuff gets publicized through corporate social media platforms that are algorithmically driven. So like we have a very difficult time even getting the word out about our stuff. And I'll meet people and I'll tell them about the site and they'll look it up and they'll be like, oh my God, I've not heard about this. And I was like, ask Facebook. You know, like you can't publicize a Vimeo video on Facebook because Facebook's a video business, and also like now they're not even prioritizing video posts. So there's a way in which like on the margins I'm sort of auditing all these systems and like noticing very concretely where the slippages are. That's a really great place to be from a research perspective. I am super skeptical about the long-term viability of this platform unless we get basically an overall deal with the network.
Yeah, I would just add on that in terms of context. There's a long history of queer media not doing well and not being supported by queer audiences. Queer print media never did well. Magazines, I mean, with all their limitations of content and style and value, none of them broke. 100,000 would have been the high point for print media, and the significance of queer print media for the political movement was essential and central, particularly when AIDS came along. But in terms of the numbers, they were never there. And you know, the commercial interests read the numbers.
Well, and frankly, most of those print medias could only exist because of advertising from pharmaceutical companies aimed at people.
Well, that's the second. That's the second. The second generation. You know, once AIDS came along, suddenly. Before that, it was phone sex, actually.
Right.
And alcohol.
And alcohol, yes. You know, and Absolute was out there, but what was lacking, which is relevant to your point and Deja's point, was what you might call community support. It's always been minimal and trivial, and the newspapers have tended to be not exactly, loyal, if you like, to the community. They've tended to be fairly self-centered, with few exceptions, like Gay Community News, Body Politic, a few others. The more local ones have tended to be bar-oriented and publisher-driven, in terms of whatever they're interested in. So there's been a curious, and this is a much larger issue, relevant to something that I was saying earlier, which is, what is the community? I mean, we use the term, the gay community, the LGBT community, the T community. From a social, scientific, analytic point of view, the community there is a very troubled, concept. Could you find it? Could you defend it? And could you, except, I would say, in the case of response to attack, or the AIDS crisis, which brought about more community solidarity and response than anything else, understandably. But community's always been a term used for political and rhetorical reasons that you really wouldn't have to want to defend, say, in your sort of academic, analytic context.
I would just say the most heterogeneous answer we get on our surveys in Chicago when we ask about sexual identity, it's like, we get queer, we get bi, we get like all kinds of really cheeky answers. Like people identify all kinds of ways. What?
Did you get furry?
Furry? Actually, we haven't had any furries. But like pansexual, ambisexual, like all kinds of things.
You think of that as cheeky?
Well, no, the cheeky ones I can't seem to remember off the top of my head. But there are like really like people like sort of needle at us, like why would I even identify with a sexuality, right?
Yeah,
like
that's where the kids are at.
Yeah, they're just like, what is that? I think kids is that.
No label. So, Megan, do you throw it back?
Thanks for a great panel. I have just a quick question that's following up with what Larry was saying, and I was really interested in thinking about the early role of media in circulating news of these urban gay communities, even if it's like what's going on there, at least for queer communities, what's going on there. So I'm wondering, today, do you think that media, what role, if any, do you think media is playing in moving those spaces, challenging those spaces? Like I'm thinking about like the decline of the gay bar and the idea that local communities in the age of social media are dispersing these physical collections.
I mean, I think that, yes, the answer is yes, they are. But also, those actual communities, which were, face it, they weren't everywhere, they were in some places, and you had to go there. I mean, I remember a story years ago of a sort of a autobiographical story of a woman, I think in Canada actually, who typically for the time, being a teenager and thinking about these things, went to the library, went to the library and looked up the topic, found the book, and inside, something to do with homosexuality, and inside was written, go to a big city, or move to a big city. That was the advice that everyone would get. That's no longer the case in the same way, or at least needn't be the case in the same way. And I'm not only talking about Mary Gray's work, I mean, there are people outside the big cities. But also, it comes to you now. You can engage with it, at least online, which isn't actually, everything you want necessarily. So, but those have changed, and they partly changed it because those communities that became iconic, like in San Francisco, and Gail Rubin, who knows more than anyone alive about, what has happened there, and the change was, they're gentrified. They're now, the people who went and created those communities are now my age. And one of the things they turn out to do is they don't want kids around, spoiling their property values and confusing things. So those communities no longer work. You have to do new ones. And online has become, as far as I can tell, where these things tend to happen. The consequences of that, I think, are something that, this is an academic context. These are questions that people should be looking at, should be studying and asking. AJ is telling us a lot about how it's happening online, but it's also happening in the real world. And I think these are really important questions because the resources are no longer the same. Let me recommend as a historical footnote, the ABC series, When We Rise. How many of you saw that? It was just, it was just broadcast in February. It was supposed to be, gay roots. And, to some extent, it played that role. But it follows the story of 3 real people, actually living, they're still alive, all 3 of them real people, all of whom, Cleve Jones, Roma Guy, and Ken Jones, all of whom moved to San Francisco around 1970-71, in part because of a story in Life magazine. So a teenager in Arizona, a young proto-queer feminist, coming back from the Peace Corps, and an African-American in the Navy in Vietnam, see a story in Life magazine about this, what's happening in San Francisco, and they move there. That was the kind of thing that was happening then. And the equivalent of that now, that's a really open question. It's a good research question.
I think it could be, I don't know if Vincent will get into this, it could be RuPaul's Drag Race for gay male bars. Like that's keeping a lot of gay male bars alive. And a lot of it's like people come in through Instagram, like now the queens on RuPaul's Drag Race like grew up doing drag like when they were 14 and like posted photos on Instagram for like a decade to make it to VH1. But Bar for Queer Women, have almost all closed. There's like so few left.
But going back to Larry's point about media, the Newsweek article about Northampton, Massachusetts being Lesbianville had the sort of the equivalent, I remember.
Is that how you ended up?
Well, I didn't know until I went to UMass Amherst, and I remember standing in the corner of a street in downtown Northampton going, heaven!
Okay, and I would just add an update since I live there still. It's a bit, I think people feel a bit betrayed, and I sort of gently remind people that was 28 years ago. But it's not gone, but it doesn't have the public, it doesn't have the public face, and people often complain about people being coupled up with kids.
It ages out.
It has aged out. But there is a kind of, there's a queer, trans, really, scene that I don't know a whole lot about it because I'm truly, I don't belong there. To put none too fine a point on it. So there's something is going on, but the idea that if you have a choice, that you take a job at UMass Amherst because there's lesbians everywhere is disappointing a few people.
Oh no. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break, reconvene just after 6, and so help yourself to snacks and and beverages and everything, and we'll get going with our second panel. Thank you very much.